So hello everybody, welcome to the Transport Tavern. I hope you're all doing well. Unfortunately, my fan on my computer has whizzed up. But first, of course, usual check: can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me? So I'll just wait until. I hope you've all had a. I hope you've all had a good week. So I'll just wait for somebody to tell me that they can hear. Couple of seconds, there's a bit of a delay. Yes, thank you, David. So, lots of Davids in the room. So, welcome everybody to the Transport Tavern. I hope you're having a good evening and had a good week. This week, I'm exceedingly happy to welcome Dr. David Rooney to the show. So, David, welcome, and tell our viewers what anything about you and your background.
Well, hello, David. Another David. Thanks very much for having me on. Delighted to be here. Bit about my background. I've been working in museums for the last 25 years. In first the Science Museum, later the National Maritime Museum, and then about 10 years ago, I found myself as curator of transport at the Science Museum. And I decided to start a research project which has led to what I'm going to talk about today, because I was always interested in how cities work, which a big part of that is infrastructure. I was interested in the politics of all of this, as well as the physical nature of it. And I started thinking about traffic quite hard. And what occurred to me quite soon was that whenever we talk about traffic in cities, we talk about it as a problem. We talk about the traffic problem, specifically congestion. And so whenever we're talking about traffic or moving around a city, we're talking about it in its failed state. Another thing that occurred to me was that when we're thinking about traffic problems, we're often thinking in terms of the users of the transport network. So the problems that a car driver might have compared with a van driver or a cyclist or a pedestrian, for instance. So there's clearly a politics involved in all of that. But what seemed to be less often talked about was the people whose professional disciplines were trying to solve the problem of traffic, and how your entire worldview as a professional might affect the solutions you might put forward to solve this problem, which seems to have so many facets. So I started this project, which was to look at traffic congestion or the traffic problem in terms of different professional worldviews. If you're an engineer or a planner or an economist or a property developer, what does the traffic problem look like to you? The end result was a book, which I'll be plugging relentlessly through this talk, and also the kind of the case study that I thought I'll talk about today, which is the worldview of the civil engineer and flyovers.
So, shall we? Yeah, thank you. Shall we get on to can a road be fascist?
Yeah, I thought I'd start with a title like that. And of course, the answer is no, but people can be. First of all right, so I'm going to set the scene. We're going to start in Canning Town, but we're going to end up in ancient Rome somehow. But we're going to start in East London. So if you wouldn't mind holding on for just 1 second. So let me set the scene first, right? It's September 1934. We're all standing on a newly built concrete flyover in Canning Town, in the borough of West Ham in East London now. We're part of a huge crowd on this flyover. The streets are festooned, David, with flags and paper flowers. And if you wouldn't mind, please, revealing the next slide, you will see in a moment.
It doesn't want to play ball.
Well, that's the story of my life.
Sorry, yeah. Okay, let's start this again. Okay. Sorry, everybody. PowerPoint doesn't want to play. There we go. got there again.
It was worth the wait. I think you will all agree, because we are standing on this flyover in 1934 with the Minister of Transport, Leslie Hore-Belisha. And as you can see, he's pulling the cord on a plaque to name the new flyover Silvertown Way. And as he stands there, he exclaims, "I declare this approach to the London docks open to the King's subjects for their free use forever." And then the ceremony is complete, and we all troop off to nearby Stratford Town Hall for the speeches. And here's what Leslie Hore-Belisha, the Transport Minister in 1934, had to say in his speech, which I just think is really an interesting way to talk about a new flyover. He was remarking on Benito Mussolini's recent opening of a road in Rome called the Via del Impero, a thoroughfare through Rome. And this is what Hore-Belisha had to say about Mussolini's new road. He said, "It was only a dictatorship that could make that true." And then Hore-Belisha in his speech said, "Silvertown Way is the conception and the achievement of democracy, surely as bold an undertaking as the Imperial Road of Rome," referring to the Via del Impero. So that got me started thinking about what flyovers might mean. Now, if you wouldn't mind seeing if PowerPoint will allow us to look at the next slide. When we think of concrete flyovers in London specifically, it's quite likely that we think first of roads out to the west of the capital, roads like the Westway or the Chiswick flyover. You can see the Chiswick flyover being opened there by Jane Mansfield in 1959. A bit of a contrast from Leslie Hore-Belisha opening his flyover in 1934. So we're thinking in the period of the post-war era, the 1950s to the 1970s, usually when we think about flyovers, we might think of ideas like segregation. So fast motor roads to the western suburbs, no pedestrians allowed, only motor traffic. We think of cars, largely, not lorries or vans. And we generally tend to think, when we're looking at these, of the middle classes, the middle class exodus from the centre of the city out to the western suburbs. And I think the same, generally speaking, goes for post-war concrete flyovers in towns and cities across the UK. This wasn't just a London idea. So when we think of flyovers critically, we tend to think in terms of urban planning. We think of the idea of post-war urban planners wanting to totally reconstruct cities' circulation systems, partly because of the destruction of the Second World War, enabling them to rebuild, but a long-held desire to rebuild cities so that they function better, so that their circulation system functions better, to solve this problem that I mentioned at the start, which is the crippling congestion of cities. So that sets the scene, I think, for how usually concrete flyovers have been talked about. And I wanted to look slightly differently at them because I think it's quite revealing to look a little bit further back. So I took as my starting point a similarly heroic urban planners' approach to road building will solve all the problems. We'll be heroes by building new flyovers. But I'm going to approach it from outside of the urban planning discipline. I'm going to approach it from the world of civil engineers, actually. And I'm going to be looking at the interwar period, not the post-war period. And I'll be looking, as you've realised, at gritty East London, not glamorous West London. And we'll be looking at working class freight haulage. Originally horse-drawn freight haulage, horse-drawn carts, and then later on motor vans and motor lorries, rather than affluent middle-class passenger transport, ultimately cars. So what I'm saying is we're going to be looking at the left-hand picture on the screen rather than the right-hand picture, which seems more familiar. And in doing so, there's a lot of this evening's discussion is going to be about empires, and that provocative question that I asked, can a road be fascist? I'm going to be looking at empires, specifically the British Empire of the 1920s and 30s. Really interesting time for the British Empire. And at the same time, Italian fascism and its glorification of another empire, the ancient Roman Empire, with which it wanted to connect itself for legitimacy. So that's the setup, David. to talk about concrete flyovers.
Okay.
Shall we go and have a look on the ground at a map of East
There
London?
we go.
There we go indeed. What we're looking at is where, how and why our flyover got built. This is the vast Royal Docks complex in Silvertown and North Woolwich. It's the Victoria Dock, the Albert Dock and the King George V Dock. Built between the 1840s and the 1920s on previously deserted low-lying marshland. First came the Royal Victoria Dock, top left of the picture. That's now the one that's got the XL Exhibition Centre running along its northern side. Then came the Royal Albert Dock, top right of the picture, and then later in the 1920s came the King George V Dock, under construction at the time of this map, and the dock structure that runs between the Albert and the King George V is the runway for City Airport today, just to orient you with the geography of London. So it's an absolutely vast dock area by the 1920s, actually by the turn of the centuries. But not only that, as well as the docks themselves, numerous, countless factories sprung up along the riverfront, which you can see at the bottom of the picture, the River Thames. And they were housing noxious trades that had been ousted from London proper by the 1844 Metropolitan Building Act. This area then was not technically London, it was West Ham. And London proper was ousting the worst of its industries just over that boundary line to this area here. Now, Charles Dickens described this area in 1857 as follows. He said it was a place of refuge for offensive trade establishments turned out of town, the oil boilers, gut spinners, varnish makers, printers, ink makers, and the like. So that was in the 1850s. Now, in the 1930s, by the way, I'm not drinking beer this evening. I'm on the gin. Henry Tomlinson was a 1930s chronicler of Docklands, and he described Silvertown like this. And if we could have the next slide, please. But I'll read it out as well. It was a perplexity of railway sidings, roads that wander and lose themselves, creeks intruding among backyards, cemeteries, gasometers, the funnels of steamers mixed with factory chimneys, warehouses built of the refuse of Tartarus, and a formless spread of the grey homes of those who somehow must supply the reason for its existence. Some of the bigger firms that were around there are quite familiar to us today. Thames Iron Works was around there. Brunner Mond was a big factory there. The Silver Rubber Works, hence Silvertown. Henry Tate had a massive sugar works there, which is still there in Tate and Lyle, just about. You can still smell it when you go around that area. And there's a railway and a telegraph works, and then there's a huge gasworks in nearby Beckton, some of which, a small part of which is still there. Now, if we could go on to the next slide, please, David. Throughout the development of the Royal Docks, the rail network was continuously expanded, given that this area was being developed from the 1840s onwards. Of course, most of it was rail. But by the early 20th century, its road network had not been expanded to meet the demand, which by then, increased trade, had led to a massive increase of motorised goods vehicles, horse-drawn goods vehicles first, and then motorised goods vehicles. And it had become one of the worst places in London, if not the country, for road traffic congestion. By the 1930s, total volume of goods handled at those three Royal Docks was over 1 million tonnes a year, and much of it then was transported by road, not by rail. And that was just the docks. That was then supplemented by all of the traffic to and from the riverside factories. So by the turn of the 20th century, this area, the road traffic in this area was becoming a problem. And right from that time, the turn of the century, just as motorised traffic was coming in, the local business interests started lobbying for a solution to the congestion problem. The first coordinated demand came in 1902, when some of the factory owners petitioned the West Ham Corporation to look into it. And between then and the 20s, there was just so much agitation and various plans put forward to solve the problem. Now, the tone of some of the agitation, I think, helps shed light on why Silvertown, the viaduct, the flyover, was different from, say, Chiswick in the post-war period. I was really interested reading 1914. There was a local pressure group put out a press release about the problem. And the spin that they put on it was to do with class, really quite powerfully. So they said, this is 1914, remember, and they said, public feeling in this district particularly resents the attitude of the road board. That was the board then responsible for road redevelopment. And it was said that the road board then was favouring West London at the expense of East London. Sounds familiar. By funding arterial roads. And the press release said, they will chiefly be used for the purposes of pleasure. Rather than, they said, the urban main roads, such as those in Silvertown, which are, they said, of far greater intrinsic value to this country. So they were saying that the road board were funding arterial roads, these joy roads in West London, and they were leaving behind the roads that were the engine of Britain's economic success in East London. Now, in 1919, as we will all know, having celebrated their centenary last year, the Ministry of Transport was established. And when that ministry was established, they started to galvanise action in this area. The new Director General of Roads of the ministry was Henry Maybury, and he was told as one of his first pieces of work to prepare a scheme for improvements in the Royal Docks traffic area, which he in 1920 described as containing congested roads carrying probably the heaviest traffic in the world. So the Director General of Roads for the Ministry of Transport said that this area of the Royal Docks, which many people will never even have visited today, had roads which carried the heaviest traffic in the world. Now, of course, there's a lot of hyperbole in that, but nevertheless, that's how the problem was being framed. Later in 1920, his proposals were ready, and I think we should have a look at them in some detail, if you don't mind moving us to the next slide, David. Now, normally I'd be waving my hands at this map to orient us, but I'll try and do it by describing. So what we're looking at is the yellow road, the East India Dock Road, which is coming from central London, heading east-ish, northeast-ish, and taking the problems of traffic in turn. You'll see just about as the East India Dock Road goes over the first bit of the River Lee in blue, you'll see the words Iron Bridge. That was the name of, you might be surprised to hear, an iron bridge, which was a very narrow bridge that passed over the River Lee, been there for a long time. The first proposal from the Ministry of Transport was to widen the eastern end of the East India Dock Road and then build a new iron bridge over the River Lee with much easier gradients and a much straighter approach. You can see the approach to the iron bridge there is almost a right angle bend at both ends, and you can imagine, particularly for horse-drawn but also motorised traffic, particularly long loads for freight, that was a major problem. Now, by the way, in his proposals in 1920, his outline costings for that bridge replacement were that it would replace iron with steel, which was conventional for bridges at the time, but in the report it pressed for an alternative that was taking the engineering world by storm, reinforced concrete. And I just want to share with everybody how concrete was being described in glowing terms at that time, which perhaps we might feel deserves a hollow laugh later, a century later. Concrete, it was said, would cost approximately 2/3 of the cost of a steel bridge. Fair enough. It would require less constructional depth, allowing better road grades. Fair enough. In other words, we wouldn't have to dig down so deep so the bridge could be sorry, the thickness of the bridge would be shallower, so you wouldn't have to have such a high grade to get up to it to allow things to pass underneath. But this is what I found amusing. Its upkeep would be nil and its life indefinite. That was the proposal for the iron bridge replacement with concrete. The next blockage, if you travel along that yellow road a bit further, you'll find Canning Town railway station. You'll see that the road travels over the railway line just south of Canning Town railway station. That was another pinch point, not just because it was close up to the station, but also because if you see just past the railway line, you've got a 90-degree right angle turn into what's called the Victoria Dock Road, and that was the road down to all the docks. So a steep right angle turn was, again, terrible for congestion. So the idea was they would rebuild the railway station by setting it back further, another wider new bridge, and then a much easier radius turn into the Victoria Dock Road, which would speed up the approaches in both directions to that. But as you then follow the Victoria Dock Road down, and it's off most of this map, the most significant proposal of the Ministry of Transport was to build a flyover. As this road went down towards the docks, to build a wide, elevated viaduct road along the line of the existing Victoria Dock Road you can see there, but it wasn't a viaduct as in filling in a river valley or going over a railway line. This was a viaduct that starts at grade and then lifts the traffic up over an existing network of whatever, and then carries the traffic down back to grade at the other end. A modern flyover, in fact, pretty much Britain's first modern flyover. Because the Victoria Dock Road had some extraordinarily bad pinch points. Could we please, David, try to get up the next slide? This is a drawing from the Ministry of Transport, and you can see, if you just orient yourselves, you see the dotted line going off to the east is widening of the Barking Road and Beckton Road. It's that right turn down southeast, the dotted line there, which is the line of the new flyover, what's now Silvertown Way. As you can see, it has a little stub coming off to the Royal Victoria Dock. It continues further and it drops down to grade, as it still does today, on the North Woolwich Road down to the south of the area. Now, what did it need to carry traffic over? Well, the first problem was, you can see that that dotted line passes over railway tracks. A critical level crossing known as the White Gates, named, I think, because they had white gates. And that was an absolute pinch point. Further down, you'll see that the dotted line also crosses the entrance to the Victoria Dock itself. One entrance anyway, the western entrance. The Victoria Dock entrance had railway lines running over it, as you can see, and a swing bridge to let the ships through. And that itself was a terrible pinch point. We'll come on to all of these in a bit more detail in a minute. I've got some lovely photographs to show you. So the scheme was well received in 1920. It was published in the annual report of the Road Board, then administered by the Ministry of Transport. And if we could go on to the next slide, please. In the Road Board's report, the strategic nature of those pinch points that I mentioned was highlighted. So this is a photograph of the iron bridge that I mentioned at the start, before it was replaced. And what the report said this: the iron bridge is the funnel through which are poured all the streams of traffic bound for riverside and dock destinations from Poplar to Tilbury, 16 miles as the crow flies and 20 miles of river frontage. And it was all funneling across that 2 tracks, single lane in each direction, iron bridge with steep approach gradients. That was the first problem that needed to be solved. Second problem is the next slide, which is the White Gates level crossing. Now, just take a moment just to look what's going on here. That's the level crossing that I mentioned, where the Victoria Dock Road has to get over some of the railway lines that go towards the docks. And if you follow that horse-drawn and motorised line of traffic, it goes as far as the eye can see, back beyond the line of buildings in the distance, and that's when the gates have just been opened. It was noted in the report the entire rail traffic to and from the docks passes between these two gates. The confusion and congestion, it said, are almost indescribable. And if we could move on, please, to the next slide, we'll see the dock entrance and the swing bridge. And again, if you just let your eye pore over this badly photographed at the archives by me photograph, you'll see a line of traffic that goes way back, much of it horse-drawn. So, of course, the speed at which these vehicles could pick up once the gates were opened was very slow. All in all, the report said, the effects of these blockages were cumulative. All these obstructions are so close together, it said, that when one is removed, the flood of dammed up traffic is immediately added to the block already forming against the next barrier. In other words, you might solve one of these pinch points, but all that does is move the problem along to the next one. What was needed was a holistic solution to this problem. And it wasn't just delays to vehicles that was hampering trade in the area. Delays to pedestrians was a big deal then, because where would all of the dock and factory employees come from? They didn't come in cars, they came by foot. And the bad timekeeping by factory employees who were prevented from getting across these level crossings or dock entrances just as much as the vehicles were, was causing an economic challenge for the factory owners as well. In summary, the ministry said, it can be said without exaggeration that delays here produce a retardation of movement through the entire metropolitan area. In other words, the whole of London gets jammed because of these pinch points. But the cost was huge. £2 to £3 million for the whole scheme. That was in 1920. Let's fast forward to 1929, when the scheme finally got royal assent to proceed. And we might ask, why did it take over a quarter of a century to get that road scheme off the ground? Well, then as now, this might seem quite current, the delays in building new infrastructure. The building of new roads, in this case, whether arterial or elevated, was absolutely bound up at that time with labour and unemployment policy. Most of the road building programme of the 20s and 30s was paid for under unemployment relief policies, with the result that new roads did not necessarily map onto locations of congestion, or rather, political geographies of highway engineering did not always match congestion geographies. That's not just my view on things. The name Rhys Jeffreys will be familiar to some of you, the former Road Fund secretary and roads campaigner and writer, who said this in 1927, and I think it's worth me quoting this in full. 1927, he said, "It mustn't be forgotten in reviewing the arterial road programme that it is a compromise between conflicting ideas and interests. The government, being concerned mainly with the relief of unemployment, were impelled towards projects affecting undeveloped land, free from those dilatory and costly obstacles which haunt all clearance schemes. The undertakings which were ultimately selected were not always those holding first place on the traffic priority schedule." In later years, Rhys Jeffreys explained that that was why the Victoria Dock Road scheme took so long to realise. Unlike the arterial roads, which were largely built on virgin land, the dock road involved widespread clearance, which then as now is expensive and politically charged. So road congestion relief was not always a quick win, and it wasn't always politically advantageous, especially in the shabbier parts of town with their cramped spaces, their working class populations, and goods vehicles and trams and buses jostling for space with motor cars. However, they got there in the end. Maybury, who'd written up the scheme, he retired in 1928, but as chief engineer, his protege was a man called Charles Bresee, who took on, and he was the ministry's chief engineer for many years after that. So after 2 decades of promotion and design, Maybury, who designed it, was about to deliver it as a consultant, a retired consultant, and it was Charles Bresee who was going to deliver the berth. So it was time to start building the Silvertown flyover, which we will begin to look at, please, in the next slide. How's this going so far? Enough concrete?
Yes. Unfortunately, there's a bit of reverb when my audio's on for so I'm on mute at the moment. But yeah, no, lovely. If anybody's got any questions, please do do ask away. I'm sure David would be happy to answer them. On that last one, I really like this sign, warning to craft, on the right. I don't know what that's about, but
I mean, when you look at these photographs, these were taken from the report, and obviously they'd sent a ministry photographer to document the problem so that they would have real evidence to put in front of their paymasters, effectively, on why you need to propose a £3 million new road. And there's so much detail in them. You can see these beautiful, very high resolution prints in the archives. They're just gorgeous. I mean, they're the sorts of places that don't normally get photographed, and that's what makes them such interesting historical archives, I think. Plenty of photographs of the West End and the western suburbs and the arterial roads. How many photographs of the Victoria Dock Road have you seen in this period? Massive amount of detail. You can see the railway yards in the background. For people who are interested in shipping, as you say, the warning to craft. You know, this was very much a maritime space, but also you can see houses. You can see pretty good houses for the managers probably there, and then probably out of shot the very poor slum housing that the dock workers, the factory workers, and the hauliers might have lived in. Just filled with details. Gorgeous. So, well, let's have a look at the concrete. So work began on the Silvertown flyover in 1932, and it was completed just under 2 years later in 1934. And there are some pictures there. The completed flyover is the big picture on the right-hand side. You can get a sense of the route that that's taking from the maps that we talked about earlier. You can see that little stub coming off at the right, which takes you down to the Royal Victoria Dock. You can see quite clearly the two places where it's passing over the pinch points. The White Gates level crossing, top right of that picture, and the dock entrance you can see clearly middle centre left, and then you can see the road coming back down to grade on the North Woolwich Road down in the south. On the top left-hand picture you can see the structure of the flyover supports going up, and you can see the deck structure being built on the bottom left picture. And that's a picture, David, that when we were talking earlier, I thought was the same as the one you showed me. But as you can see, it's different and slightly later, I think, or earlier in the development. They're pouring concrete there. Altogether, this was, this was a massive civil engineering project. 6,000 piles, reinforced concrete piles, were sunk to support the foundations, and each of the structures along here, whether it was a bridge over the level crossing or the bridge over the dock entrance or whatever, each of those structures was specified to be able to carry a 100-ton vehicle on 4 wheels. So 100 ton on 4 wheels, 25 ton on each wheel, as a dynamic load in the 1930s. They were designing this for really heavy goods transport.
There was nothing that heavy at this time, was there, really? That just
as individual vehicles, but the idea of kind of road trains or of road locomotives hauling very much longer, like railway locomotives, hauling very long loads was definitely part of the thinking at this time, which makes you think about this. This was about gradients for one thing, either for horse-drawn vehicles which need shallow gradients, or for the motorized vehicles that weren't so powerful then. But it was also about the turning circles. It's about the plan view and about easing those right angle bends so that longer vehicles that might only have front steering would be able to get round. Now, the Silvertown viaduct, Silvertown flyover, Silvertown way, whatever you want to call it, was really novel. It was novel. I'll mention two ways. First, it was an early British example, if not one of the earliest substantial British examples of the grade separated urban flyover. In other words, as I said, an elevated road passing over not just a single river or a road or a canal or a railway, nor just filling in like a bridge or a simple viaduct, nor was it just filling in a valley like the Holborn Viaduct from the 19th century, filling in the river valley to prevent vehicles having to go down and then up. This was a road which would take you from the street, fly you over a crowded existing network at ground level, and then drop you back on the other side of it. That was new at this time. Secondly, it was about concrete. It was realised largely in reinforced concrete, a technology that was reshaping civil engineering and architectural practice and the public's view of them at that time. Very briefly, the first reinforced concrete building in Britain, 1897, Weaver's Mill in Swansea, was followed by projects at such a pace that by 1926, the Concrete Industries Journal, which I really can recommend as a bedtime read, was able to put out a vast conspectus of progress in concrete engineering by that time, 1926, covering everything from bridges, buildings, viaducts, sports facilities, dock structures, industrial plant, utilities structures, and sculpture. Concrete was modern, and its industry that was led by specialist architects, engineers, and contractors, importantly, they were working with the energy and the reforming zeal of pioneers. This was a frontier town. And interestingly, I think its introduction as a constructional medium matched in date the introduction of the motor vehicle. Almost identical chronology, introduced in the late 1880s, mid 1890s, and really starting to take off in the Edwardian decade and onwards. Another symbol of dislocating modernity, as concrete was, and a technology that demanded new structural forms that reinforced concrete could offer, but also was changing the highway landscape because of the increased power that motors had, and therefore changing things like grade and turning circles.
So, David, we've got a question from Owen. If you're happy to have a crack at a question, the bridge over the dock entrance looks pretty low. Was it movable, or did they just lose the entrance for anything too big?
That's a really good question. It's not movable. Previously, that was a swing bridge, as you found. If I remember correctly, they decided that they could take any traffic that any sail traffic that couldn't pass under that. They could take out the east of the Victoria Dock and through the Albert Dock, and then out the east exit of the Albert Dock. If I remember correctly, I may have got that wrong, and if I have, please forgive me. It's a while since I've looked into this. But if I remember correctly, they suspected that motor shipping, which could drop down any high masts, could get under this, but anything that couldn't, they would go the long way around. So, yeah, could we move on to the next slide, please? Because I mean, I'm kind of not that interested in claiming world firsts or UK firsts. It's not the first viaduct, of course it's not. It's not the first flyover, really, and what's the difference between the two? But it was, I think, and others think, the most comprehensive and influential concrete viaduct flyover system in Britain in the interwar period. There were earlier examples. You can see there a viaduct in Dover, 1922. The Lee Valley Viaduct, part of the North Circular, that's been demolished, 1927. That was to cross a shallow river valley, as you can see. And a system of barking, also 1927. But again, these were largely for taking roads and passing them across a smaller number of obstructions, as you can see from the virgin land underneath some of them, rather than over an existing network. In the United States, in the 1920s, engineers were starting to think about, well, in one hand, double deck or viaducted urban streets like Wacker Drive in Chicago, which is now a triple-deck system along the river front in Chicago. Very well worth visiting Chicago if you're interested in your urban transport infrastructures. They're also starting to think about streets with grade-separated interchanges, like the Bronx River Parkway in New York at that time. But none of those early schemes matched the scale or the complexity, actually, of the Silvertown scheme in East London, which claimed to clear the most congested streets in the world, but also showed planners and engineers how vertically separated concrete roads in urban traffic black spots could create a new network for the circulation of traffic. I'm going to come back to that idea of a new network rather than a replacement network later on. Once it opened in 1934, we saw Leslie Hore-Belisha. Once it was finished, Charles Bresee was moved on to his next project at the ministry. Leslie Hore-Belisha told him to carry out a comprehensive survey of highway developments that would be needed in London over the following 30 years. And it'll be familiar to many of you as the Highway Development Survey of 1937. I'm sure you, like me, have a copy of this close to your bedside for reading at any moment. Written. Well, you can see how many little post-it flags I've got in here. There's never a moment when the Highway Development Survey in 1937 doesn't provide you with the quote you're looking for. I've always said that. It was written by Bresee with the help of the architect Edwin Lutyens, completed 37. And in those plans, I think you can imagine like a light bulb switching on in the minds of highway engineers across the country, if not the world, the idea that a new motor road network like the Silvertown Way scheme could be literally overlaid onto the existing London street pattern. It could be placed from on high over the existing streets, and significantly that this would be aesthetically but also morally good. 5 years after Silvertown Way opened, Charles Bresee was discussing it with a group of traffic experts, and this is what he said. It's to the credit of this viaduct that, from it, travellers gain a fascinating view, never before given to them, of docks and shipping which are invisible from the streets at ground level. Viaducts, he said, are so often and so thoughtlessly denounced as destructive of beauty that we do well to remember the refreshing and hitherto unsuspected views that they may reveal. And at the same time, demonstrating how a 1930s engineer was talking like you might expect a 1950s urban planner to talk. Bresee in the 30s described proposed new roads leading north from the dock area as follows. Many of the areas that would be traversed by these new routes are so woefully dejected and so stricken with decrepitude that the wholesale demolitions and consequent replanning which the building of a wide new thoroughfare would entail could only be regarded as a boon that is long overdue. That really does sound to me like the 1940s and 50s total reconstruction way of seeing the world. Now, new roads cut through old London were, of course, nothing new, but the novelty in the 30s was the practical feasibility that the Silvertown Way demonstrated of new roads flying over the old, partly because concrete enabled that, partly because motor traffic could manage the steeper gradients. So, and I'm not just making this up, if we could please move to the next slide. And this is a really interesting GPO film unit film that shows Charles Bresee talking about the traffic problem in the 1930s. In 37, the film unit made this film to publicise the publication of the Bresee report. It's nice to think, isn't it, that a road survey has a film made of it, but that's how life was in the 30s. Bresee in this film is seen to lament the failure of Christopher Wren to rebuild London in the 17th century after the Great Fire on a rational grid system. And Bresee described Christopher Wren's plan as a plan so enlightened, so far-seeing, that it would even have met the needs of modern traffic. That's often talked about in urban traffic in London, is the failure of vision by not taking up Christopher Wren's grid plan in the 17th century. It's a trope. Instead, in this film, the streets had remained unaltered, an opportunity had been lost, and the result, says Charles Bresee, was congestion. Now, the voiceover person of the film says this. I'm not going to try and do the accent. I usually do, but this is being recorded, so I won't this time. It says this: quick transport is essential to trade. Trade is London's life. Congestion strangles it. But there is a way to ease this congestion. Just as Wren made a plan for 17th century Londoners, so Sir Charles Bresee has worked out a plan for us. And then it cuts to that photograph, to the shot of him top centre of the picture, of the image there. Bresee is seen looking down from his lofty office window onto the congested streets near St Paul's Cathedral below. And then what he starts to do in the film is to place a series of transparent overlay sheets onto a map of London. And each of those transparent overlays, you can see one of them top right and one of them bottom left, each one of them shows parts of his proposed new road network, which was crossing and encircling the city. So that idea of literally laying down a network on top of an existing road network was this light bulb moment that the engineers felt concrete can enable us to do something quite new. Then in the film, Bresee himself says, we must build elevated highways on viaducts. We must drive tunnels under obstacles. We must have roundabouts and flyovers of the most modern type. We must adopt every device for facilitating the movement of traffic and giving it the clearest possible course. Again, think about how that sounded in the 60s or the 70s. That idea that we must just push our way through these obstacles. Tunnels, Silvertown tunnel this year, never out of the news in southeast London. Building elevated highways on viaducts, roundabouts, flyovers, every device. We've got to keep the traffic moving. That was the way it was being talked about in the 1930s. 20, 30, 40 years earlier than the realization of that in the modern town planning or urban planning discourse after the war. In the Highway Development Survey, expressed vividly in that GPO film, what Bresee was doing was proposing not to replace Christopher Wren's medieval street network that Wren was faced with, not to replace it, but to overlay a new grid of concrete roads hovering literally just above the tangled surface of the city, the height of a flyover just above the surface of the city. And the public also was being brought into this culture of concrete at the time. One engineer reported in 1927, the general public is gradually being educated into the many uses of reinforced concrete, and everyone is now well acquainted with this material, which is considered a symbol of strength and durability. Now, that description, those final few words, a symbol of strength and durability, really spoke to me when I was starting to think about empires, which you'll remember is going to be part of what this evening is about, because you could apply that description to the British Empire at the time. That is very similar to the way the British Empire was being talked about in the 20s and 30s, a symbol of strength and durability. Very, very similar rhetoric between how you talked about the British Empire and how you talked about this new miracle modern material, concrete. I know that might sound a little bit tenuous, but I mean, stick with me because I think I can follow through with this. If we could move on to the next slide, please, David. Now, I mentioned Henry Tomlinson. He was the chronicler in the 1930s of the dock area. He, in 1935, so the year after the Silvertown flyover opened, he wrote a fictional visit of a traveller who went to visit Silvertown docks by train. The miles of concrete quays as the traveller walks eastwards to Galleon's station for a train back to town will tell him more of empire than all the exhibitions. For there are ports and ports. London is more than a seaport. It is a world market. The mention there of concrete, the concrete quays, because a lot of the structure of the docks here was built out of reinforced concrete too. With the opening of Silvertown Way and the development of the other concrete structures in the Royal Docks at the time, this was an imperial concrete that seemed much more real to some people than the concrete exhibition halls on the other side of the city in Wembley. The Empire exhibition in Wembley, which I'll come on to in a little bit briefly later, very much concrete structures and concrete, the vision of empire in Wembley. But what Henry Tomlinson was saying was, never mind those exhibition halls. That's not the real empire. The real empire is here in the docks in southeast London. And the concrete here, whether it's a flyover or a quayside, that tells you more about the world market that is the British Empire than anything else. The docks here were the heart of the British Empire. That's the point here. These docks, this area that you're looking at now, was the heart of the British Empire in the 1920s and 30s. There was a House of Commons debate on the new flyover in 1927. Remember, that was before it got royal assent, so they were still arguing for it. And the Labour MP for Silvertown, Jack Jones, in the debate, he decided to put on a bit of theatre for his fellow members of Parliament. He said, "Not a mere arterial road," swelling his breast and raising high his head, apparently. He said, "but an imperial road that Caesar would have gloried in." That's how he described the plans for the Silvertown flyover. So in the context of empire, and let's just look actually at the name of the road for a minute, the Silvertown Way. Because in the months leading up to the completion of the scheme, there was bickering about what Silvertown Way, as it became known, should be called. Early suggestions was King George V Avenue, or Prince of Wales Avenue, or simply London Dock Road. By September 1934, the flyover was about to open. The name still hadn't been decided on. And you might think I'm being a little bit fanciful here, but this just goes to show just how much politics is embedded in infrastructure. 7th of September 1934, the Ministry of Transport's Deputy Chief Engineer wrote to the Minister, Leslie Hore-Belisha, to say this. He'd obviously been asked to look into this, and he reported on the results. "Inquiries have been made from all sources in London concerning the Via del Impero in Rome. A note is attached, giving all the information together with a sketch illustrating the road." Please, if we could have the next slide, we'll see a very badly scanned photograph from the period of the Via del Impero, or Imperial Road, or Imperial Way in Rome, a new thoroughfare that had been opened by the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini in 1932 to reduce traffic congestion, but more importantly, as a ceremonial avenue designed to bring into view Rome's ancient imperial past, the ancient Roman Empire. So that was the Via del Impero, the Imperial Road or Imperial Way. A few days later, Leslie Hore-Belisha named his new road Silvertown Way, not Avenue or Dock Road, but Silvertown Way. In 1926, another time the scheme was being debated in the Commons, MP Jack Jones had said, "It is not a road for West Ham. It is not even a road for London. It is a road to the Empire." And the following year, as I said a moment ago, he described it as not a mere arterial road, but an imperial road that Caesar would have gloried in. And that was some years before Benito Mussolini built the Via del Impero. These ideas of empires were really part of thinking at the time. And the idea of the Via del Impero was that the road would connect the past to the future by engineering views of the public passing along the road in Rome down into the ruins of ancient Rome, the archaeological remains that had been uncovered and revealed. So again, we've got a height thing going on here. you would be travelling along. It's not a flyover, it's an at-grade road, but you'd be looking down, as you can see some of the trenches and pits at the side, down into Rome's imperial past. When he opened it, Mussolini had said, "We must create the monumental Rome of the 20th century. Rome must be a city worthy of its own glory, and this glory must be renewed incessantly so as to hand it down to future generations as the heritage of the fascist age." That's what Mussolini said as he opened that road in Rome. Could we have the next slide, please? The connection that was made by Jack Jones to Rome and to empires, as we heard earlier at the start, was picked up by Leslie Hore-Belisha in his ribbon-cutting speech and then the Stratford Town Hall speech. And he referred to Mussolini's Via del Impero as follows. It's a fairly long quote. Again, forgive me, but I think it's worth telling you this. This is what he said in Stratford Town Hall. And just keep in mind what you're looking at in the picture there, which is the newly opened Silvertown Way. That's a concrete flyover. Silvertown Way is the conception and the achievement of democracy. Silvertown Way is as bold an undertaking as the Imperial Road of Rome. Not only is there about it an equally fine touch of imagination, but it has the advantage of serving an even more practical purpose. It exposes to view not the ruins of our past, but a vision of our present maritime greatness. Till now, the London docks have been hidden from sight. This road gives a perspective of them, so that all who use it may see the ships which carry our commerce. This has been done by the people, by the so-called common men and women who had the idea, who have made the road a worthy outlet to the world. I mean, that's a speech for opening a road. He pressed home the point about that public view from the top of the flyover. You can see cyclists and pedestrians here. This was not a segregated flyover. More on that in a minute. He said the London docks are no exception to the general rule that docks and wharves are usually hidden behind high walls which shut them out of public view. The new road with its bridges and its viaducts will allow Londoners and visitors to London to gain a far-flung view of the waterways, docks and wharves which represent the foundation of London's wealth. This is the Aladdin's cave of London, and 1,000 years of the romance of its commerce, wealth and industry are reflected in the scenes that are visible from these new viewpoints. I think it's hard to overstate the significance of the view of the docks from the top of this flyover. The eminent geographers Felix Driver and David Gilbert have said this: the ebb and flow of goods at the docks determined the fortunes of hundreds of thousands of working class people. There was, in this sense, no more significant sight in the landscape of empire. Many of the visitors to the area were sailors or immigrant workers at that time. Felix and David have noted, for many, the first sight of London was of the vast and strange dockland landscape on a ship sailing up the Thames estuary. But it wasn't always a good view. Another chronicler, Albert Linney, described the old Victoria Dock Road as wretched a street as could be found in London. What an impression of the capital of the British Empire must have been given to foreign sailors emerging from the Royal Victoria Dock into London. Every time I walked down that road to the White Gates level crossing, I was appalled at the squalor of the scene. Now I'm lurching slowly, David, towards some kind of conclusion you'll be pleased to hear. Having mentioned... thank you. Yeah. You're kind. I mean, everyone else is logged off, but that's fine. Having mentioned Mussolini, let's talk about the other fascist dictator of the period. Adolf Hitler had also spent the early 1930s building imperialist highway infrastructure, namely his motor roads or Reichsautobahnen program, initiated in 1933. Now, This is really interesting, I think. Hitler's project, just as with Mussolini's project, was being held up for comparison, good or bad, with the Silvertown flyover by the commentators who were close to London's road building scheme at the time. Rhys Jeffreys again, the campaigner and secretary of the Roads Board, had travelled widely in Europe and America looking at their roads infrastructure. And just hours after the Silvertown Way was open to the public, Rhys Jeffreys was on board the German airship, the Graf Zeppelin, along with several officials from the UK Ministry of Transport, as part of the 1934 International Road Congress, hosted by Hitler and his deputy Rudolf Hess. Those engineers from the UK were all inspecting progress on Hitler's road building scheme from above. And what Rhys Jeffreys was really impressed by was Hitler's single-minded ability to press forward his highway plans, building roads capacity before the congestion had brought traffic to a halt rather than after, as Jeffreys claimed had been the case in Silvertown. Mussolini and Hitler, as with the other dictators of interwar Europe, wanted to reshape their countries. The historian Eric Hobsbawm pointed out the antiquity of European civilization deprived them of the most obvious way of doing that, the building of entirely new capital cities. So their solution often involved building new imperial infrastructure, whether it was the Moscow metro, the Dneprostroi Dam, and we can add Hitler's autobahns and Mussolini's Via dell'Impero to that list. But Democrats as well as dictators wanted to create modern cities too, and so the Silvertown flyover was an equally radical reshaping of old London, a modern engineering monument in concrete to the power they wanted to project of the British Empire. And I mentioned earlier the concrete imperial architecture of Wembley at this time. It already existed in the 1920s. Empire Way is a street in Wembley, was Concrete Street, part of the British Empire exhibition, 1924 to 25, up there in northwest London. A complex which was expressed in concrete, which offered visitors the chance, according to the guide, to inspect the empire from end to end. There was also, of course, if you're looking for imperial grand infrastructures, there's the Mall, London's Ceremonial Avenue, remodelled in the years after 1901 to commemorate Queen Victoria. That's very much an imperial avenue, of course, when you look at it. And you can easily see the London County Council's Kingsway thoroughfare that leads north off Strand, opened in 1905, very much as an imperial avenue, a wide thoroughfare cut through the city. But those imperial roads were about show and ceremony. And I'm arguing that it was the Silvertown Way in East London that was the expression of a new imperialism that wasn't about pomp and ceremony. It was about trade, free trade specifically, an empire about circulation of people and goods. And by opening up that empire of people and goods to the public view, an expression of modern democracy versus modern dictatorship. And in many ways, interestingly, and in a complicated fashion, it was a Labour expression. Capital L, Labour. Jack Jones, the Labour MP for West Ham and Silvertown, had set out the Labour view of the British Empire in his memoirs that he wrote in 1928. And he was characterising Labour's policy on the British Empire as based on the ideas of self-government, especially in India, against the Tories' approach of govern and control, which had thus far been largely the case. What Labour wanted to encourage was in India, in their case, along the lines of Canada and Australia, as he described it, a free, independent, completely self-governing part of the Commonwealth of Nations, which we call the Empire. Labour's imperial policy, he said, was to trust the people on the spot, to develop self-government wherever possible, to repeal unfair treaties, to be truly democratic in foreign relationships. So, I mean, all sorts of ideas are going through our minds right now at a time when we're thinking about our relationship with other parts of the world and trading with them. Labour said Jack Jones in 1928, will abolish all artificial barriers, will make intercourse free between people in the firm belief that increase of knowledge of people and things is increase of understanding. Labour will endeavour to increase cheapness of transport and travel and abolish irritating restrictions. Well, now, isn't that an interesting set of comments this year at a time of Brexit? Okay, I'm going to start to wind up now. We have looked, David, have we not, at an apparently mundane and little known today concrete flyover in East London. Very little attention these days, getting more attention as the Silvertown tunnel rumbles on, but in its day, it was held up as a national statement of democracy at a time of rising fascism in mainland Europe. That's what I mean by saying, can a road be fascist or can a road be anti-fascist? In this case, that's how it was being framed. The British Empire might have been beginning its decline, its rapid decline in the 20s and 30s, but in cultural terms, it was presented more strongly than it had been in the Victorian period. But the discourse had turned to being reform of the empire, reform from within, and ideas of empire with progress, modernity, and an emphasis placed on machines and efficiency. The home city of the British Empire was London, but it had to work well. There was no room for inefficiency. So this was about an efficient machine at the heart of the empire, literally moving around the people and the goods that were the engine of the empire. The Victoria Road scheme, therefore, with its flyover, was unlike any other road building scheme in London at that time or even remotely near it. As I said at the start, it was about freight rather than private transport. It was about the working classes rather than the middle and the upper classes. It was about industry rather than leisure. And it was cramped, congested urban streetscapes rather than virgin agricultural lands. I will finish with a quotation from an editorial in the Times published on the day that this viaduct and flyover was opened. And they said this: the Victoria Dock Road and the road from Cairo to the Cape are as much parts of the same highway as were the Via Flaminia and Watling Street in the days of the Roman Empire. And those who see today the magnificent sweep of the new road will agree that the modern engineer is no way inferior to the classical in his conception of what the beginning of an imperial highway ought to be. And that was how the Times reported it, but I think it's definitely time that I shut up for a minute. We had more of a chat. So thank you very much. I will stop. Well, I put these slides in not knowing how much I would have run over time, because so I was involved in this project. It led to a book which came out last year. It came out in paperback 2 weeks ago, which brought the price down to a very modest £29.50. But the project that started it, thank you, I appreciate that. And actually, I've got one here that, of course, that I can brandish. It's a really good book, honestly, really interesting. I mean, it's a cover-to-cover read. If we can go back to the first of those modern pictures, David. So about 10 years ago, I started this project, and this was just one of the case studies. I get just as interested in traffic lights and guardrails and computers as I do about flyovers, but I believe really strongly that if you're going to understand infrastructure, or any kind of technology or engineering, that as part of your research methods, you have to go and explore it. There's only so much that you can learn about the Silvertown flyover in this case by reading archival sources. There are 2 reasons why I think you need to go and visit. Firstly, because it shows you things like the physical embodied experience of passing over the flyover that you can't get from a description. That idea about the view of the docks from the top. In that right-hand picture, you can see I was standing on what was the entrance to the Royal Docks, now been filled in. You can see all the way along the Royal Victoria Dock, all the way past the XL Exhibition Centre. You've got that view. You're not so high that the thing is like disembodied in plan view, but you're not so low that you can't see past the first ship. You're at that favoured position where you can see the whole of the empire before you. Now, if I'd read that in the quotations that I shared with you, without having been up there, I wouldn't have known what it really meant.
I suppose the process of going looking at allows you to take photos and things that you might not find and seek out much more actively the perspectives that you need as a researcher rather than relying on other people's shots.
Exactly. So if we could move to the next slide, if you're interested in what was the existing infrastructure that this new road was built to service or to bypass or to be part of, here are some pictures I took. Now, on the left-hand picture, the structure at the top is the Docklands Light Railway track, so forget that. But what you can see down below is the railway lines, which are still there, embedded in the road surface for all of the industrial railway networks, for all of the big factories and industrial works on the River Thames. So they're still there. If you look at the right-hand picture, you can see communications networks, telecoms networks, electricity networks, street lighting. You can see old road layouts. So effectively, by visiting, you get revealed to you the network which you then want to study. You get revealed it unpeels the modern surface of the network to tell you, in many cases, literally which companies should I research, because in many cases infrastructure carries names. It carries the names of companies. If you want to understand the history of electrification in this area, just go and have a look at some of the duct covers on the pavements to find the name of the company that provided the street lighting, because that wouldn't have changed since like 1900. So that idea that you can explore, like urban exploration, you can find what you need to then research in the archives, is really strong. And I teach a couple of modules on a couple of history and geography courses about infrastructure, the history of infrastructure. And what I make absolutely clear is you have to, if you can, there are many reasons why people can't, possibly because they're not in the city that they're researching, but if you can, you have to go and visit, get your eyes open and smell and feel and talk to people. In the next slide, finally, I get really interested in, there's this sense in some of the planning literature, the geography literature, that there are places that are no places or non-places, like airport departure lounges or other structures of modernity, which they're not real places, like they're not grounded, they're places that people pass through. I'll not go into the details of that and why I have some problems with it, but if you want to understand how a flyover, a concrete flyover, is a real place, get down to the bottom of the Silvertown flyover and you'll find all of the arches, as was originally planned, by the way, are filled in with businesses. And you can plot any kinds of patterns you want by looking at those places of work, places which people come to visit every morning to work and go home from every night in the pre-pandemic days. You'll see patterns of migration around the world. So you'll find evangelical ministry churches now in some of those arches. You see Somali hairdressing supply shops. You'll see all kinds of real places with real people in, which help you understand the world. That's the point I'm trying to make. If you study infrastructure, you're not studying concrete, you're studying people. And that's why infrastructure has politics. That's why a road can be fascist, because all of these things are just actors in a human network made by people for human reasons.
I think, well, just to echo your thoughts, I've been doing a bit of non-places reading for my work, and I'm not overly happy with it as an idea, but this idea that there's you know, underneath the infrastructure is, you know, we go back to the 19th century. It's the same with railway lines. The arches are vibrant places where people come together and businesses formed, and you know, I mean, I wondered, did they? Because we got a comment from Phil. Surely engineers only saw the congestion where they looked at cities and forgot about the essence of a city as a pleasant place to live and work, which the roads did much to destroy. And I know later on you've got the Buchanan report, which talks about these issues about destroying life. But was there any sense of a negative reaction to the Silvertown?
Well, that comment is really gets to the heart of what interests me about all of this, because what that comment perceptively reveals is you've got these different mindsets, and what I was trying to do in the wider research project was to compare and contrast. If the engineer thinks about solving it this way, what about the urban planner? What about the scientist who might model their way out of congestion? What about the property capitalist who wants to build nice residential that they can sell? So that point is really important, that then the idea of civil engineers, and it of course is more complicated than I'm talking about in this short chat, then the idea that came later with Buchanan was a more nuanced version, where they started to reveal, after some of the post-war excesses of road building, the consequences of them had become clear. That seemed quite late, because a lot of what was discussed in the 1930s was about slum clearance and about making working class areas better for people. So if the West Way famously was the political hot potato that ended massive road building projects in London, if the West Way really turned its back on the residential areas that it carved its way through, it's slightly different in the 1930s with Charles Bresee and Henry Maybury, because they were very conscious of the working class area that they were overlaying on top of. And it was very much a paternalistic view, which is that it should make life better for those, because we can clear the slums, we can rehouse people in new buildings. There's a whole new housing estate that the Silvertown people built in Prince Regent's, just a bit further away, which is still there, for rehousing. So the idea was more benign, but the consequences of it were just the same. If I have presented an idea that the Silvertown flyover, as Charles Bresee discussed it, was overlaid over London, almost as if it just sat lightly as a spider's web gently above the surface. Of course, you look at the bottom left picture on this slide, and you look at those 6,000 concrete piles, and you see that actually the land take for the Silvertown flyover was massive. This was not something plonked down from above and everything else continued beneath. They raised the whole area underneath and around. So there was massive destruction to build this flyover. It was presented as this more non-interventive, if you like. But you look at those piles, that's not the single monolithic piles of some of the flyovers in West London after the war. The land take here was massive, and you can still see that it's blighted in many sections of length of the viaduct. It's just fenced off with that metal fencing.
I think that's a fantastic place to leave it in the modern era. David, thank you so much for coming and speaking to everyone about this fascinating subject. Hope you enjoyed it. And oh, wait a minute, there is David's book, and I'll pop a link to where you can buy it from Routledge in the show notes, and paperback, hardback or ebook. So yes.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to be present in the Transport Tavern this evening. I've had a whale of a time because I really like talking about concrete flyovers.
Well, we should perhaps get you on to do something in the future as well. About, well, there's a whole book there, so yeah.
There is a whole book there, as you say.
So next time, everybody, we've got Sophie Vora, Dr. Sophie Vora. She's just passed her Viva, and she's going to come on and talk to us about celebrating and commemorating Britain's railways. So she did her PhD thesis on the anniversaries of the railways in 1875, 1925 and 1975 and more modern, and she's going to look at how the railways have celebrated and commemorated their own history and why. So all that remains is for me to say thank you, David, so much, and
Thank you,
well, everybody, we'll see you next time. Goodbye.